Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 11. I'm in my office today, so usually I record these from home, but thought I'd make it a little more official this week. Okay, so week 11. So that means essentially we have about 4 weeks left, a little over 4 weeks to the end of the class. So that means that you definitely need to start thinking about final papers. If you guys have ideas for topics, if you want to run a draft by me, let me know. Send me an email. Happy to look over it. Okay, so last week we were looking at progressivism, and progressivism is a huge topic, right? It's something that I could spend an entire semester talking about. We could spend an entire semester talking about, but it was probably behind the American Revolution and the American Civil War, in my opinion, the most influential era of political thought in American history. So I think a lot of the programs we have today, a lot of the structure that we have today, came out of those 25 years. So it's a relatively short period, but the things that happened during that period were pretty profound. So I'm not going to try to recapitulate everything that the guy said from Hillsdale College. One thing I would say about that lecture is that Hillsdale is traditionally known as a sort of a bastion of conservative thought, right? So that was the best lecture that I could find on progressivism. But I just want you to keep in mind that the guy who was giving that lecture was coming from a sort of a particular political bent, as most of us are, but I try to be as objective as possible. So even though he was putting a pretty, I would say he was putting a pretty negative spin on progressivism, it has a lot of good things came out of the progressive movement. So I just want to go through it real quick. Not going to try to discuss it in detail, but just sort of hit some of the key points and some of the things that I heard come out of the discussions. I've responded to your discussion questions or to the discussion, so if you want to take a look at some of my responses, some of my questions, they're available to do that. Okay, so the first thing to say is that when we say progressivism, as with any other movement, right, it's a generalization. So, and he even talked about this in the talk, it can be difficult to try to put that label down because there are so many different, strains of thought within what is, sort of called progressivism. But we'll try to capture some, but that's just sort of a qualification in the beginning that when I say progressivism, it is a generalization, right? And, different thinkers sort of came down in different places on that spectrum. You can look at it as a spectrum, best way to look at it. Another thing to remember is the context, right? The context under which progressivism came out. Just like in the American Revolution, right? The intellectual context of that time was the Enlightenment thinkers, specifically political Enlightenment thinkers. But, Newton, right? Newton was sort of the center of the Enlightenment, with his theory of natural laws and Newtonian mechanics and things like that. And political thinkers believed at that time, that just as there are laws that govern the universe, there must be laws that govern human behavior. And they set out to prove them, like Adam Smith, right? We're talking about economics. John Locke talking about government. So that was the mindset that these guys were coming from. Now, just sort of staying on the intellectual track for a while, the intellectual mode of thought at the time of progressivism was called American pragmatism. And pragmatism, was a response or had developed out of the Enlightenment thinking, right? The Enlightenment thinking says that there are natural laws that govern things. We can know what those laws are. If we apply certain scientific principles to it, we can uncover truth, right? That's the big word, truth, right? But pragmatism had a more relativistic view about, truth and what constitutes truth, right? Because there were several skeptics that had come along after the Enlightenment and tried to demonstrate that, these laws or descriptions of truth weren't didn't hold up to scientific scrutiny in a lot of cases. And this happened over and over and over again. And people eventually started to think, well, maybe all these laws, maybe these things change over time, right? Maybe they evolve. Because going along with Newton and the Enlightenment, another major thinker for progressivism was Darwin. This was around the time that Darwin was about, and we'll talk a little bit. And just as Newton's laws were infused into politics, they tried to infuse Darwin's laws, theories of evolution, into society. It's called social Darwinism. Anyway, so they were less certain about these philosophical truths, right? But pragmatism became much more, rather than trying to describe the properties of the universe and the laws of nature and things like that, pragmatism took a much more pragmatic take on it, you could say, and they were trying to actually apply certain types of knowledge and certain types of truths into situations to solve problems. Right? It was more of an action-oriented, what works is what is true, sort of philosophy in a nutshell. Right? So rather than trying to sort of sit back in our studies, our offices, and trying to describe truth, they actually tried to put these best principles into action. Right, so that's sort of the mentality, the dominant mentality of the time. William James, psychologist, John Dewey, huge, in education, sociologist, right? So philosopher. So he wore lots of hats. But anyway, that was sort of the intellectual context at the time that progressivism cropped up. Now, in addition to the intellectual context, there were a lot of historical things that were happening. Right? Remember, the progressive movement, typically people say it started around 1890, right? So the Civil War had, been over for not that long, right? 25 years or so. So yeah, the country was still very much divided. Reconstruction was still happening, right? And we were still trying to figure out, how do we put ourselves back together after the Civil War. So that was one thing. Another thing was, the massive industrialization, right? The Industrial Revolution had happened, right? Where all this advanced machinery and technology had come into our labor force and had radically changed the way that, the way that we did work, the way we worked, the way that we did business, right? So this just led to, enormous profits by corporations who are able to utilize these technological advances to, be extremely productive. But it also led to abuses of workers, right? Because people were trying to make money sort of hand over fist. A lot of these corporations or big businesses were sort of taking advantage of the workers, and the working conditions were terrible. Because this was something new, there wasn't a lot of oversight. And as I'm talking about this, it may seem like it bears some resemblance to things of today, right, in a certain sense, right? We had, the Industrial Revolution then, we sort of have the internet or the digital revolution has happened recently, so we find ourselves in sort of a similar place. So just something to keep in mind. So we had the Industrial Revolution, we had the Civil War. Immigration was huge, right? We looked at Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, right, talking about the huge amounts of immigration that were happening in the United States. So that was changing the landscape of things. You had urbanization. A lot of people were moving from the countryside to cities. So we had all the immigrants were living in cities. People from the countries were moving to the cities, and the people who were already in the cities were there. So we have all these people coming together in a very small location, and that raises all sorts of public problems, public health problems, housing problems, education problems. How do we respond to these things, right? So that's sort of the backdrop of what's going on when this progressive movement pops up, right? So what are some of the major points of progressivism? Well, one we already talked about a little bit, right? One was this notion of objective laws versus relativity, right? This notion that there are no immutable, eternal laws. Society changes over time, and government needs to change with it. Right, the way we do business needs to respond to those particular issues. So that was sort of the philosophical orientation that progressivism was coming from. The role of government, right? This is really huge, and it goes back to, in a lot of ways, it goes back to pragmatism, right? So, I think the speaker we listened to talked about, how in the Constitution and the Declaration, a lot of the focus was on natural rights and the rights of the individual, right? And whereas with progressivism, rights started turning into entitlements, right? So, not only do you have the right to the pursuit of happiness, right? So you have the right to work to try to become happy, but perhaps, under this progressive view, you could be entitled, to happiness, we could say, right, as an example. And we put things, we start taking actions to turn that right, which a right sort of rests upon the individual, right? And an entitlement rests on the implementation by an external body, the government, to make sure that that right is actually put into effect. So yeah, they thought that the government should play a much more active role, right? We have all these problems, that have happened since the Industrial Revolution, right? We have the terrible working conditions. We've got the immigration problems. We've got urbanization problems. We've got education problems. All these problems that are facing us, and they were frustrated that the government that was designed by the founders, which was specifically designed not to function efficiently, right? That's the whole point behind the Constitution, right? Is the checks and balances, the separation of powers. And they did that for a very good reason, right? So that one particular party or one particular body couldn't, seize the power and it become a tyranny, right? They didn't want power to be centralized. They wanted things to be hard to get through. With some provisos that said, in the times of a crisis, the executive gets more power, things like that, and they can step in, right? So, but yeah, they didn't want that. The progressives they said, we got these problems, they need to be solved. Therefore, we need to consolidate power, right? And how did they do that? I mean, there were a lot of things that they did, right? They strengthened the power of the executive branch, most prominently seen during FDR. He was the closest thing, probably even outside of George Washington, the closest thing that we've ever had to a king or a monarch in the United States. So yeah, they wanted to increase executive power. They wanted to, obviously they were very concerned about diminishing the power of political parties and some of the institutions that were put in place in the Constitution. And they made a lot of huge steps to do that, right? By passing the 17th Amendment, which said that senators were popularly elected, right? Up until that point, senators were not elected by the people, right? They were still chosen by the states. So taking power away from the states, they said they want to cut out the middleman, right? They just want it to be big government and the people, right? So hope you feel comfortable squaring off against the government as an individual, right? So there's no middleman. There's no dissemination of power. They were also very interested in administration and administrative structures, right? That was another thing that came out sort of this particular period, was this notion of professionalization, right? Expert knowledge. We send people to these schools. They become experts in public policy. They become experts in environmental policy, whatever, right? Whatever your field is. And those are the people, through that specialized education that they get and their understanding of how an administrative system works and bureaucracy and things like that, those are the people who are the most qualified to handle these particular issues. Not the politicians. It's these experts who should be, handling these particular situations. And they do it in these independent administrations or agencies that are created. Probably the most famous, infamous, however you want to think about it, is the Federal Reserve, right? That was created during the time of progressivism that obviously plays a major role in the functioning of the United States, but it's supposed to be sort of politically insulated from all the political processes that are happening. So let's see. Right? I mean, they were very interested in changing the Constitution. They wanted to, they actually wanted to lower the criteria for amending the Constitution. They thought that it was too rigid. They thought, we need to change things. This document was written 200 years ago. We need to work on it, right? Yeah, and they wanted to weaken the separation of powers, as I said, right? So that's sort of where they were coming from, right? There's obviously, like I say, we could talk for weeks about the progressive movement, but that's just sort of a general overview. I thought you guys did a good job of describing it in the discussions, so I appreciate that. So what were some of the good things? Because there were a lot of good things that came out of the progressive movement, right? Child labor laws, right? Making sure that children weren't being taken advantage of. Women's suffrage, right? This is where women got the right to vote. And you certainly can't say that that's not progress, because, even given the standard of the Declaration of Independence, that all men, which, we should read as all people are created equal, according to that standard, this is sort of extending that to a segment that was not put into place. Labor unions came out of this to protect the rights of the workers who were being taken advantage of during this time. 17th Amendment, it's hard to argue that, having senators being popularly elected gives more power. It's certainly more democratic, right? It gives more power to the people rather than the state legislature, so that could be, you could see that as a positive. People were able to participate in primary elections, big deal, right? And yeah, I mean, there were a lot of the National Park Service. So if you guys have ever visited a national park, you can thank the progressivists for it. If you've ever been to Yosemite, which if you haven't, I definitely recommend it. It's one of the most beautiful places. But the Everglades, things like that, right? They're all come out of this progressive era, right? And Social Security and all these other social welfare programs designed to help people. So there were a lot of good things that came out of progressivism. So what if I had to criticize progressivism, what would be some of the things that I would say, right? Well, they talked about how the Constitution is a living document and it needs to be amended and things like that. My response to that would be that the founders also thought that the Constitution was a living document, at least some of them, right? I mean, certainly Thomas Jefferson, he was even more radical. He thought that every generation that came along should write a new Constitution, right? So you could certainly say on certain fronts that Jefferson was a progressivist, at least his view towards the Constitution, right? But I mean, that's why Article 5 of the Constitution is in there. Well, that's why we have procedures to amend the Constitution. And sure, it's not easy, right? Because it has to be ratified by the states. But a question to ask yourself is, how easy do we want to make it to amend the governing document for our society that has lasted for however many years, right? That we're up to, right? So I think it should be hard to amend, right? Because we don't want, like, let's say for instance, we have sort of one party come to power and they have a very different philosophical orientation than the others, right? So they come in, they amend the Constitution. Then the other party comes in, of the opposing view, they amend the Constitution back, kind of like Prohibition. That's another thing that came out of progressivism, right? Prohibition was put into place, especially the religious aspects of progressivism really pushed, Protestantism really pushed for Prohibition, because there was this whole saloon culture at the time where people went, the guys were back in the smoky bars making all the decisions. And so yeah, that was one of the major issues, that they wanted to get rid of the saloon culture. Anyway, where was I? Living document. Yeah, right. So it should be hard, right? It should be hard to amend the Constitution. It's not something we want to flip-flop on, right? Yeah, and another thing is this notion of progress, right? That's a big deal. What do we mean when we're talking about progress, right? Usually it means, moving in a direction towards a certain stated goal or a certain good, you could say, right? So that makes me think about, their notions of relativism and, not having a grasp on truth. If you don't have some sort of truth or standard that you're gravitating to, how can there be progress, right? And I suppose that they could argue that this standard changes throughout time, right? But then the question becomes, who determines what progress looks like? What's the standard, right? And if, and some people brought this up in the discussion, if you're going to centralize power, there has to be sort of an agreement to what progress looks like within that government, right? And even if there's not agreement, there has to be purported agreement, or you won't be part of the central government, right? So progress is it's a tricky term, especially if you're basing your progressivism on relativism, rather than some standard. Like if my standard is we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, I know how I can make progress towards that ideal, right? I can make progress by making sure that all people, not just all men, but all people are getting those rights, or are being created equal, the certain unalienable rights. And I can work to implement those rights and make sure that that's happening across the board. But if I don't have a standard, and if my standard changes from administration to administration or whatever, it's much harder to measure progress on that level, right? So I guess that's my main philosophical contention with progressivism. But make no mistake about it. Our government right now has been markedly influenced by progressivism, and it's quite possible that you could even argue that we live under a progressive government right now due to the things that were put into place in the beginning of the 20th century. So anyway, this week we're going to be leaving progressivism for a while if we can, right? Maybe we can't, if we can, but we're going to be moving on to the wars, America at war, right? World War I, World War II, where we still had progressivist presidents, but to see sort of how this period played another pivotal role in American political theory. So anyway, that's enough rambling for this week. If you guys have questions about progressivism or about your papers or whatever, shoot me an email. I will post the discussion question tomorrow.